We continue our series on the 36 decans of the Zodiac today with Leo 2, the second decan of Leo. Leo is a fire sign, so it's all about inspiration. And it's ruled by the sun. The sun is the object in the sky that all the other planets revolve around. So it has this centering force. It's about our creativity. If you think about the sun, it provides a certain amount of warmth and joy. It allows for photosynthesis, which allows for things to grow on the earth. So there's a creative, playful quality to Leo as well. It has to do with shining for other people because it does have this social quality. And it's a fixed sign, so it's going to have this consistent quality of shining forth. But what happens or what makes the second decan of Leo different from the other decans? And one thing you can look at is the planets that rule it under the Decanic system. And here it's Jupiter and Jupiter under both systems. I'll unpack that in the upcoming video, what it means when you get the expansive energy of Jupiter along with shining forth in the world of the sun. We'll go through some ancient esoteric texts that describe the face and deepen our understanding, especially perhaps of some of the shadowy side of this decan. And then we'll explore the tarot cards associated with it, as well as some numerology and some references from the Kabbalah. And finally, we'll finish off with an example. Christopher Reeves, who played Superman, is the perfect example of a life associated with this decan. He had his ascendant degree in this decan of the Zodiac. So there's a lot to unpack. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, like and subscribe. It helps people find my content. So first, let's talk about the planets, Jupiter, Jupiter, and Sun that rule this decan. Jupiter, one of the best ways to understand it is to compare it to Saturn, which is sort of has the opposite energy. Where Jupiter is a planet of expansion and abundance and optimism and growth, Saturn is the last planet we can see with the naked eye, so it's about limitations and restrictions, responsibility, what's possible through hard work over a long period of time, what's possible in the material world. So Saturn sets limits, and Jupiter wants to break out of limits and wants to expand and grow. And so when we have a decan that is all about shining in the world, that solar Leo energy, and you combine it with this expansive Jupiter energy, we get people who are going to be or have experiences perhaps where they get some positive notoriety. They get acclaim in the world. They're appreciated. They maybe leap into situations that other people wouldn't leap into because they have a certain confident, outgoing nature. I see this with clients who have Sun Jupiter contacts in their chart. But and also one of the downsides, it's amazing to have Jupiter trine your sun in the birth chart because it does bring this capacity to move out in a confident way in the world and put your energy out there and say, I can do it. But I always warn folks who have aspects like that that there's a potential for what the Greeks called hubris if you have a contact between Jupiter and the sun in your chart. And the notion of hubris is one example of that in Greek mythology is the myth of Icarus. Icarus was a young man who was on the island of Crete with his father Daedalus. And the king, Minos, the king of Crete, was out to get them. And so his father built some wings out of wax and attached them to their backs and told his son Icarus, he said, be careful when you fly away using these wings, don't get too close to the sun because they were made of wax and they would melt. But of course, Icarus was a young man, he's who and didn't listen to his dad. And he flew too close to the sun, the wings melted, and he fell to his death. And the Greeks use this myth as an example of what happens if you're hubristic, if you get overly confident, if you think you can fly, if you don't understand the limitations of what it is to be a mortal on this earth, if you think you are a god, if you forget if you identify with being a god. There's a notion in psychology called inflation. If your ego gets inflated and you forget who you are, right? And so that can be the vibe of this decan. So it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's got some really positive energy, and you can get a lot of acclaim. People with planets and points in this decan may have some great achievement in their life, especially if it's positive. But then one has to deal with what does it mean to have all this success and acclaim and admiration? Do you get puffed up? And what do you need to do to take care to work with that inflation or understand that you are limited as a human being? So that can be part of the energy. Let's look now at the ancient texts that are associated with this decan. First, let's look at Ibn Ezra, a 12th century, the beginning of wisdom, where he wrote the second face of Leo, quote, "We have a man whose nostrils are fine. On his head there is a shape of a crown with white myrtle and a bow in his hand. He is fierce like a lion in his anger, and he is wrapped in a cloak that looks like a lion." So here we see that idea of a crown of myrtle on the head. We're going to see that Austin Coppock, when he talks about these two decans, talks about the idea that's associated with this crown of myrtle had to do with a Roman custom of triumph, where if you were somebody who was in a battle, say you went and sacked the nearby city and had success, there would be this ceremony where you were walked to the temple of Jupiter and everybody applauded and said how amazing you were. But and also part of understanding this energy of triumph is that there's some violence that was involved, right? Your success, yes, you were successful and you achieved something, but there's a little bit of a shadow underneath that at the same time. And then we can look at the Picatrix, which is a 11th century document that's an Arabic text on astrology and magic. And in that, they describe this decan as a man who wears a crown of white myrtle on his head. He has a bow in his hand. This is a face of beauty, riding, as in horseback riding, and the ascension of a man who is ignorant and base. This is a face of war and naked swords. So again, here we see the allusion both to that idea of the Roman triumph. Somebody has won and they're getting all these accolades, but also underneath it was some war and some conflict. One interesting thing when we look at this description is it talks about horseback riding. And we're going to see later with Christopher Reeves, he was in a horseback riding accident as part of what led to his death. So, excuse me, not his death, his paralysis. So, you just see the reality that sometimes astrology can be very literal, that somebody that has their rising degree in this decan was associated with horseback riding and a fall, the shadow side of the potential of this decan. So, moving on from the ancient texts, we can also look at the tarot cards associated with this decan. And here we see the Six of Wands. And this is just a very literal representation of those ancient texts. We see a man riding on a horse with a laurel on his head, and everybody's celebrating him. And if you pull this in a tarot reading, if all the cards around it are positive and supportive, it can be a moment that's going to suggest that you're going to get some applause. People are going to think you're great and you're going to be riding high, right? Sun, Jupiter, yay. But and also, if there are more negative cards nearby, there can be a possibility of the opposite as well, that you maybe have a fall from that position of having a claim. And then here we see the Six of Wands in the tarot, excuse me, in the Thoth deck, and it is called victory. So one of the things we see here is you see how all of these wands, at the moment where they're crossing, there's this fire element there. It's like they're hitting on all cylinders. There's a success just built into the card. But then we also see that the background color is violet. And the color violet or purple is associated with the divine. So we're also seeing a divine expression here. In fact, in some ways, when we were talking about that idea of triumph in the Roman times and being walked to the temple of Jupiter, you were being celebrated as if you were the god Jupiter. Do you see? So there's something about this idea of a human being taking on success in a way that feels divine as part of this decan. We're also going to see that expressed in the Hermetic Kabbalah. The number six is associated because it's the Six of Wands in the tarot. The number six is associated with this decan, and it's the sixth sephirot in Kabbalah, which is called Tiferet. And that that Sephiroth is translates to the words beauty and harmony. There's something about the number six that's all about balance and harmony. It's located in the center of the tree of life, and it mediates between the higher spiritual Sephiroth, Keter, Chokmah, and Bina, and the lower, more earthly Sephiroth in the tree of life. So you see this again, this understanding that this is a place where God and man come together in a way, or this notion of the divine and the human come together, and the person is balancing the two. And what do you do in that moment? Do you get inflated and imagine that you are like a god, and then have the potential for hubris and a fall? So this is part of the vibe. Um, Yeah, I was just trying to see if there's anything else from my notes around that separate that I wanted to discuss. Um, yeah, so then let's move on lastly to Christopher Reeve, because his chart really exemplifies, or who he was as a human being, exemplifies just what I was talking about. So for Reeve, he had his big breakthrough role was Superman in 1978. Um, and it's just interesting because that character Superman had these godlike powers, right? He was the archetype of a mortal ascending to godlike status, possessing superhuman strength. He was invulnerable, and he had the ability to save humanity from peril, right? And so this is the role that Christopher Reeves took on. He had great success from a very young age. Even before he took on the role of Superman, it's sort of like life paved the way for him to become famous, to become this great actor. Everything flowed for him. He gained great notoriety, and he was at the top of his game in the late 1990s. I believe it was 1995 when he had his accident. And it's interesting. What happened is he had bought a racehorse. He had really gotten into riding after playing a character in Anna Karenina. He had started to begin horseback riding. And he was entered into a competition, and his horse was called Buck. Not sure I would have bought a horse called Buck, but he was in a competition, and the horse just stopped dead cold, and Christopher Reeve was thrown off the horse. His hands got tangled in the reins, and he ended up paralyzed. And what's interesting is what happened after that moment, which is he became greatly depressed, which is, if you know anything about psychology, when we enter into a depression, it can be a moment where we turn our anger inwards, right? And of course, not wanting to analyze anybody who's had a great accident and gets depressed. I would get depressed as well, right? But there can be this having to come to terms. Depression can be about having to come to terms with reality, being angry, wanting to shake one's fist at God for what has befallen you. And so he was faced in this moment with a great challenge. What do you do if you've been riding high, um, identifying perhaps with that godlike energy, having great success in your life, and then you have this great fall that brings home your mortality to you? And fortunately for Christopher Reeves and the rest of the world, he worked through that along with the help of Robin Williams, one of his good friends, and was able to turn his accident into something that he used to further sustain himself in the world. He actually gained great acknowledgement and achievement by taking up the cause of people that were disabled from paralysis, by working hard to come back and to keep living a life, even understanding his mortal limitations. Um, so the last thing I wanted to show you is I thought I'd bring up Christopher Reeve's chart because I think um, it really exemplifies the accident as well as some of these notions of hubris and the potential for hubris. He had his ascendant conjunct Pluto, which of course, that's not always going to lead to an accident or anything like that, but Pluto is the god of the underworld, and he can bring great transformation, darkness, difficult things sometimes in our life for us to struggle with. When he's conjunct the ascendant, we may have a lifetime that feels transformative. And here we see in Christopher Reeve's chart that he had his Jupiter and his Jupiter was square his ascendant. So that Jupiter in and of itself can bring a little bit of inflation, especially when it's in a square. Brings positive energy, but can bring some struggle. But what's more interesting is this yod that we see in his chart that I think really shows his accident because we have the moon with Mars. Moon and Mars, moon can represent body, Mars can represent sort of accidents or difficulties. It's the malefic planet. And then we see Mars here is in an inconjunct to Jupiter. When Mars and Jupiter are conjunct or connected in a chart, it can have to do with risk taking. And when they're in an inconjunct, that risk taking perhaps might be in an unconscious way because inconjuncts mean that the planets don't see each other. So it's like this unconscious energy. So we see an unconscious energy between his Mars and his Jupiter, but then also his Mars and his Uranus. Uranus is a planet that has to do with things hitting out of the blue, sudden events. When Uranus contacts Mars in a chart, it can be about accidents. Frida Kahlo is somebody who I always use as an example of somebody who had a Mars Uranus contact in their birth chart. And then when they had a Mars Uranus transit, is when she had her accident that led to her difficult life, but then also became part of her life story because she turned that accident and her circumstances she used as a subject of her art, right? So anyway, we can see with Christopher Reeves that there's something about his karma. I hold that very lightly because I'm not saying he should have had this accident, but we do see the potential in his life chart for some sort of accident potentially to lead to some sort of transformation in his life. Because that yod is known as the finger of God, and some people think of it as this karmic aspect that leads us to struggle with difficult circumstances in our life, but also can enrich us or change us because we've had to struggle with things that perhaps other people have not had to struggle with. So that was just a little bit of a side note, but I do think it's interesting to weave in the astrology and understand that when we're looking at Christopher Reeves and the fact that he had an accident, that that's not everybody who has their rising degree or point or planet in the second part um, of Leo is going to have an accident at all. That's not what the hubris is about. For somebody else, it could be something very different. They get accolades for how they look, and then as they age perhaps they have to struggle with the reality that those looks fade, for example, right? So there's so many examples you could look at to explore this idea of the success and the shadow side of success of Leo too. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe. It helps people find my content, and we'll see you soon for the next Decan of Leo.